In 1910, the New York film studio of Thomas Edison created an adaptation of Mary Shelley's Gothic novel, Frankenstein. The film was a commercial failure. It would be 20 years before the rise of the American horror film. Between 2003 and 2008, 135 horror titles grossed nearly $3 billion at the box office. Hundreds more were produced for home video, proving that the genre still has plenty of lifeblood. And prompting some to wonder why American viewers are so obsessed with violence. How did we get here?
If a horror film is cutting off people's thumbs and gouging their eyes out, I guess that's a certain kind of horror film, but it's certainly not the kind of horror film that interests me.
The appeal of horror movies has always been about confronting death, and in their various ways, these movies, help us cope with that, and that's one of the reasons that this has been such a long-lived genre, even from literary times on.
Fear is probably the most powerful emotion we all feel as humans. We're all afraid of death and loss of a loved one, loss of identity. All the things that you see in the movie, we're all afraid of.
In my mind, what makes a good horror movie is something that stays with you after the credits go and you're in the car and you're driving home, and that next morning when you wake up.
If you meet all the people who make horror films, you discover they are very nonviolent, they're politically active and knowledgeable and anti-war. They have opened themselves up to all of these possibilities, and it's the people who repress them who are the ones you have to look out for.
I always had this affinity towards the great universal monsters. Not sure where that came from, other than probably being a boy who felt like he was not particularly good looking and felt like a freak.
I love the monsters. I mean, that goes back to those days at the RKO Castle Hill, when even though Frankie was bothering me a little bit there, I still sympathized with him, and I've always sympathized with the monsters.
At the dawn of the 20th century, most Americans knew by heart Thomas Jefferson's stirring words from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. From the beginning, Hollywood filmmakers were skeptical. Hard truths quickly found their way into the national cinema. The Great War in Europe reinforced the nation's identity as a crusader for freedom. While the old world suffered, America thrived. But the new world had its own monsters, waiting in the shadows.
Going all the way back to the 20s, the horror movies of the silent era with Lon Chaney, there was a lot of kind of twisted people. The monster was just a mutilated person. When people came back from World War I, they came back without limbs. They came back in somewhat living pieces.
The Volstead Act gets enacted in 1919. They can't drink. They've lost arms, legs, eyes, other body parts. And so there is this both attraction and a repulsion that they experience in America.
Lon Chaney was America's first horror movie star. The monsters he portrayed were ordinary men, turned outwardly monstrous by cruel fate, and turned inwardly monstrous by the cruelty of men.
He's unaccepted by the general public. He's on the fringe, and yet he's the hero. You're rooting for him, no matter how evil he is. I love that moment in Phantom of the Opera where the crowd has got him cornered by the river, and he turns to them and he raises his hand like he's got something in his hand to throw at them. And they recoil, and then he opens his hand and he's got nothing in his hand. and then they jump on him and beat him to death, you know. But I just love that moment when he opens his hand, and not only does he open his hand, the look on his face, like, aha, you know, I fooled you, you know.
Cheney's outsider represented the dark side of American life. Fears realized on October 24th, 1929. In the midst of the Great Depression, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised to save the American dream, saying, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself."
The horror films that influenced me the most were not the classic American horror films.
Roll camera and begin.
They were the German silent expressionist films of the 1920s. I think back specifically to The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, which I thought were true classics.
Many of Hollywood's earliest filmmakers were immigrants from Europe. They brought mythic monsters from the old world to new shores.
We people of the mountains believe at the castle there are vampires.
Dracula initially was sold first as a love story and as a horror film. But I believe one of the original advertising taglines was the strangest love story ever told. And so they don't mention what's strange is that the main lover is a Nosferatu, undead.
You are too late. My blood now flows through her veins. She will live through the centuries to come, as I have lived.
It was the one that really established the idea, I think, of horror films.
Universal followed up with a new version of Frankenstein.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
It really is and still is to this day the Gothic thing that I always find myself drawn to. The period somehow seemed simpler and classier, you know, the way people dressed, the way people spoke.
Like heaven being with you again.
Heaven wasn't so far away all the time, you know.
And yet there was this, you know, like the Jekyll and Hyde story. There's this other side underneath that you wanted to get to, and that was, particularly for a boy, far more interesting, you know, that you could get this beautiful lady and then somehow you'd screw it up because you were really a monster inside.
Free at last!
Suddenly I realized the power I held. The power to rule, to make the world grovel at my feet.
Essentially, there are two kinds of horror movies. One is, it's all about where evil is, the location of it. So we can imagine ourselves around the campfire, and the wise man, or whoever, is talking to us about the location of evil, and he says the evil is out there in the dark. It's beyond the woods, it's the other tribe. It's the people that don't look like us, that don't speak like us. And that's the external evil, that's the other. The people aren't like us. But the other location of evil, same setting, the campfire and the shaman, the wise man says, actually evil is right in here. It's in our own human hearts. That particular story is a harder one to tell. It's easier to talk about the other. It's harder to say, I have met the enemy and he is us. We are the enemy.
Mr. Rainsford, God made some men poets, some he made kings, some beggars. Me he made a hunter.
During the 1930s, there was all the turmoil in Europe, the rise of Nazism. There was various problems that different countries were obviously having in establishing, okay, who's going to be in charge? What kind of forces are they going to unleash?
Ladies and gentlemen, look at Kong, the eighth wonder of the world.
Legend has it that Adolf Hitler's favorite film was King Kong.
We have to watch out for these people who are trying to consolidate and manipulate power and manipulate us.
In 1934, the Hollywood Production Code Administration decreed that all movie monsters must be destroyed by the end of every film, regardless of their motives.
The monster in Frankenstein had a sympathetic note. He was just as frightening and just as terrible as the other monsters, but there was a scene where he's at a little pond with a little girl, and you expect him to kill the little girl.
Who are you?
Maria. Will you play with me?
Instead, he is very friendly and affectionate to the little girl. And I remember when I first saw that, I was really surprised, and I would assume the audience was surprised too.
The Frankenstein story in and of itself was fascinating, but Bride of Frankenstein, you know, what James Whale did, the empathy that you had for the monster in that, and the fact that he wanted, you know, to love Elsa Lanchester at the end. As a very, very young kid, that had a really strong impression on me, you know, trying to find that other freak that doesn't want you either, you know, and then we all die.
Get away from that fever! You'll blow us all to atoms! We belong dead.
Even then, the most terrifying movie monsters were human beings.
The Black Cat is a rather unique movie in horror movie history because it's really the only one that has a sense of evil to it.
Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi star as two European soldiers engaged in a deadly grudge match.
You killed her as I am about to kill you.
With a young American couple caught in the middle. Off-screen, Americans would soon find themselves in a similar situation. The unquiet ghosts of World War I were about to break loose.
We shall play a little game, Venus. A game of death, if you like. But under any circumstances, we shall have to wait until these people are gone, until we are alone.
Truly, unquestionably, the biggest evil that I know about in recent memory was the Holocaust. There's a documentary on the GIs who got over there and they were taking pictures of some of the survivors and some of the dead bodies. Oh, my God. And that was an industry. That was an industry that was set up to kill. It was industrialized murder. That was, it was staggering. Staggering to see.
Set against the reality of genocide, cinematic monsters became less terrifying.
The Universal pictures, which are beloved by a certain generation, do really fall into two categories. The ones in the 30s, which were done relatively sincerely for the first time, and the ones in the 40s, which were basically trading on what had been done earlier in the 30s and sort of jiving it up a little for the wartime audience.
In 1942, the Invisible Man became the Invisible Agent.
Circle around a minute. Planes are going to bomb New York. I can't stop them, but I bet I can slow them down.
As the tone of monster movies softened, the target audience changed.
Let me tell you what made me change my mind.
A lot of, I think, the childhood attraction to horror movies starts with Disney, because the scares were always a huge part of what was appealing about Disney movies.
Pinocchio! Hear that beetle talk? You'd think something was gonna happen to us.
But then when you get to a picture like Pinocchio, which has this great transformation sequence in it, I mean, as good as any werewolf movie transformation I've ever seen, where he turns into a donkey, that's a pretty hairy stuff for kids. And I think a lot of kids find that they like that kind of stuff, and other kids find that they don't. But the ones who really enjoy that, you know, step up to horror movies. Well, I love the Wolfman, of course. I mean, what kid doesn't love the Wolfman? I mean, he's a perpetual adolescent. He gets hairy, and you know, he can't control himself. It's like, I mean, he's always popular, the Wolfman.
I know Kurt Siodmak. He had very strong feelings about the war. He fled Germany due to his Jewish background, and he was the one that came up with the idea of the Wolfman along the lines of a Greek tragedy. Here is a person cursed by fate who then has to try to deal with it.
Oh, I'm sick of the whole thing. I'm going to get out of here.
Whoever is bitten by a werewolf and lives becomes a werewolf himself.
Lon Chaney Jr., he was just such a pitiable fellow. He looked so sad and tragic. There's something about his whole persona that just looked terribly unhappy. I grew up in a period where being Jewish was unusual. I mean, most people weren't. And then he went through the whole war as a kid, hearing that these people wanted to come over and kill you. And they wanted to kill everybody that was Jewish. So you did feel like an outsider.
During and after the war, American cinema took on a darker, more somber tone. Lower-budget horror films like the RKO productions of Val Lewton adopted a minimalist style for economic and artistic reasons. Lewton believed that in darkness, audiences would imagine their own worst fears.
One thing I really liked about the original Cat People was that it's all about repression. You know, it's about repressed sexuality. It's about turning into an animal when you release that sexual desire. And it's about the repression of fear. And those things, I didn't know consciously what I was watching at the time. I just knew I was watching a scary movie.
One of the scariest sequences of all time, it's in The Leopard Man, where the little girl is sent on her own to go to the grocery store. Mama sends her off, and we know that there is an escaped panther somewhere in the neighborhood. And she's running and running, and she goes home to Mama and knocks on the door and demands to be let in.
Mama, say, let me in! Let me in! Let me in! If you love me, let me in!
And her mom, feeling no sense of urgency, not knowing about the panther, waits to let her in.
He's coming! He's coming closer!
Wait, Teresa! Your mother is here! Your mother will let you in!
And then suddenly we see blood coming under the door. We know that that girl is being torn to shreds on the other side of that door. That is an absolutely chilling moment, an unforgettable bit of horror. One of the things I think is really great about the Val Lewton films is that there is a psychological component to them. The Seventh Victim is basically about a woman who is obsessed with death, meets a woman who hasn't lived but wants to live.
Who are you?
The dichotomy between the woman who has had enough of life and wants to die and the one who hasn't experienced life and wants to live. And that's a major theme in that movie. Trying to put the pieces together and figure out, what is my place? Do I have a place in the world, or should I just go into a room with a noose and hang myself?
I've always wanted to die. Always. I'm afraid. And I'm tired of being afraid, of waiting. Why wait?
Human interaction is the source of horror and fear and tension. You know, it's a natural part of it. And just dealing with the world at large as a human being, you know, taking on responsibility as a citizen of the world is a big deal.
Santa Rosa, California.
In 1943, Alfred Hitchcock placed this existential fear in small-town America, in shadow of a doubt.
The Town with a Secret is kind of a staple of film noir, and the idea that things aren't quite what they seem is, you know, it's a basic tenet of horror movies. And I've always been fascinated by, you know, what's behind the door, and what's behind the picket fence, what's really going on.
Uncle Charlie appears to be the classic American success story, the Horatio Alger myth of the self-made man.
Who are you?
Charlie.
Oh.
But Uncle Charlie is not what he seems.
Do you know if you ripped the fronts off houses, you'd find swine? The world's a hell. What does it matter what happens in it?
I remember walking home from school one day, and some little girl said to me, you know, the bomb could go off right now, and we'd all be dead in a second. That was kind of news to me. I'd never really looked at it that way. And I do think that the kids of my era did grow up under the atomic fear cloud.
The first horror film I directed, although it would be more likely classified as horror science fiction, was The Day the World Ended, a 10-day black and white picture.
Rick, how much do you know about the Matsuo bomb test?
Only some rumors that nobody could actually pin down.
It is one of the first films to tackle the idea of, okay, almost everybody's wiped out. Some of the people that are left have been turned into these monster mutants. You know, what's going to happen after the end of civilization?
Impossible, unbelievable, fantastic. But I tell you, it could happen.
This was back in the Red Scare days, atomic bomb days, and a lot of very famous science fiction movies had come out
By the cruel intruder from the...
dealing with the effects of the bomb, the beast from 20,000 Fathoms, them.
The prehistoric era.
These are all creatures of the bomb, created by radiation.
When I saw Tarantula, Tarantula was only playing on Wednesday and Thursday. And so I had to get my father to take me because it was at night.
Even science was stunned. The new atomic miracle should have been mankind's greatest boon. Instead, when such power to cause phenomenal growth proved dangerously unstable, man was confronted with his most shocking blunder.
It was so scary. I was so freaked out that I went out to the lobby and I just started to pace. And I would look in occasionally at the screen. Too scared. Leaving my father alone in the theater watching this giant spider movie by himself, for which he never forgave me, I don't think. The one that I remember the most was them, because it was about giant ants, and they made a noise that was not unlike the crickets in the back of my house. I had nightmares for weeks.
We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy come true, and there shall be destruction and darkness come upon creation, and the beast shall reign over the earth.
Fantastic beyond comprehension. Gripping beyond compare. Astounding beyond belief. The mightiest monster of them all.
It's no good shooting, Dale. The bullets pass through it just like X-rays.
Probably the movie that scared me the most in my life was The Creature with the Atom Brain. I was about 6 years old, and it's not a very good movie, but boy, it sure scared me.
I promise to see you die, and I will.
There's a lot of movies that have different valuations depending on how they actually affected you.
I think people love the movies they saw when they were young. They love to eat them up.
In the age of the atomic bomb, filmmakers warn viewers to keep watching the skies.
It's round. We finally got one.
We found a flying saucer.
Come in. Close the door. Freddie, do you suppose the Pentagon could send us a revolving door?
The Thing was the first movie that really pushed my buttons.
Hi, Pat.
If you watch that movie, if you watch it now and really analyze it, they're always opening doors. And it's that old loud radio sound effect, opening the door.
Anybody around here want some coffee?
And they just are opening doors, opening doors, opening doors.
Hi, Pat.
Opening the door.
What's the matter, Corporal? This door's locked.
Attention everybody in camp. Stay where you are and bolt your doors.
Close the door, please.
When you find what you're looking for, go ahead and open it.
Sooner or later, of course, you know that the Thing is going to be there, and goddamn.
It had one of the all-time great, well, several great scare scenes, but one is when they set him on fire. Full burn. That was great stuff.
It tells a lot about where this country was and where the world was in 1951. More so than I think a lot of, quote, mainstream pictures. The political situation of the time was such that there were very few, quote, liberal science fiction movies. Certainly, you would call it Came from Outer Space would be a liberal science fiction movie because the aliens, they just want to get home and they're not really bad and they've been misunderstood.
They promoted the individual, the smart, scientific, versus the community that's a little bit behind the times, is not accepting of the aliens.
But that wasn't really very popular. I mean, it was much easier and more spectacular to do aliens who really were out to get us.
Gee whiz.
In Invaders from Mars, conservative forces knew just how to deal with anyone that looked different.
You gotta hit him right in the puss with the grenades if you want to stop him, Major. Nothing works but blowing them apart. Here they come!
And now, fought with the terrible weapons of super science, menacing all mankind and every creature on Earth, comes the War of the Worlds.
They come from another world, spawned in the light.
By the second half of the decade, alien invaders had learned to be more subtle.
But will you tell these fools I'm not crazy?
From city to city, an incredible hysterical panic spread.
I remember going to see it at the Coliseum Theater on 101st Street. Believe it or not, it was the second feature on a double bill, Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
No, you've got to get out of here, please.
I think I sat through that picture twice because it was so good.
What time is it?
7:45. Yeah, I know. It's too early to be so busy.
What are they doing here?
But it was interesting that people could authentically read it as a metaphor, either for individuality, here's the conformists of the 50s who are trying to tell everybody what to think, what to feel, how to act, or a metaphor for communist takeover. Here are these soulless, unfeeling people who want to have an ideal future by eliminating what's really human about us, trying to take away our freedoms. There were very real anxieties of the time. Are the other side crazy and insane? If they really have no emotions, what would stop them from, breaking a treaty, pushing the button, doing the unthinkable?
Filmmakers continue to target the fears of the rising generation.
Every one of you watching this screen, look out. Because soon, very soon, the most horrifying monster menace ever conceived will be oozing into this theater.
I am William Castle, the director of the motion picture you're about to see. You'll be given a supernatural viewer like this, which will enable you to penetrate for the first time into the spirit world. I feel obligated to warn you that some of the sensations, some of the physical reactions, which the actors on the screen will feel, will also be experienced for the first time in motion picture history by certain members of this audience.
I have the booklet for the seat buzzers that the exhibitors were sent. And they were war surplus motors that had to be, inserted into the seats in the theater. And it was quite a big deal. And there was, warning, electric shock, and a lot of complicated instructions about how these things have to be worked and how the projectionist has to activate them. And it was like, most theater men must have thought, I don't want to do this. I mean, this is crazy. And it was pandemonium, basically, and it was a lot of fun. And the movie was designed for that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream. Scream for your lives. The Tingler is loose in this theater, and if you don't scream, it may kill you. Scream! Scream!
The success of Gimmicks, I think, started to peter out after that. I mean, that was really a high point that you couldn't really top.
Good afternoon. Here we have a quiet little motel. Perfectly harmless looking, when in fact it has now become known as the scene of the crime.
One of the first movie loves of my life was the movie Psycho. I saw it at the drive-in in 1961 as a kid. And in those days, horror movies were thought of as kids' movies, even Psycho.
Psycho put audiences on notice that nothing would be off limits anymore. Anyone can die at any time. And the most sympathetic character in the movie can be the most diabolical.
Beginning of the modern horror film was Psycho, 1960. That was the turning point. Most horror films before then, not all, but most, were Gothic romances. Take the Hammer films in 56, 57. They were all in castles with Dracula and Frankenstein and barons and the European aristocracy. Psycho was a whole different breed of movie. In a way, it prefigured what was going to happen in the culture.
What has she done to you?
In the following years, filmmakers tried to outdo Psycho in shock value. Hitchcock continued to push the limits of on-screen violence in his next film, The Birds, to see just how much audiences were willing to watch. Drive-in director Herschel Gordon Lewis went even further.
Blood Feast. It's barely above the level of a home movie, but when it played theaters in Chicago, I mean, they closed them down, and it was a big scandal because this is pornography, and it's the sheep entrails and all that. This is totally unconvincing today, but at the time it was very transgressive.
People wanted to see movies like Mondo Cane, which was a documentary all about death and grotesque rituals around the world, because it's what you couldn't see on TV and what you couldn't see in the theaters.
In this manner, they exalt the flagellation of Christ.
So you wouldn't see those at the Warner Hollywood or the Pacific Paramount or anything like that. You'd see them at the little Cracker Box Theater downtown or, on the wrong side of the tracks.
Some seasoned filmmakers competed not simply by increasing shock value, but by increasing the production value of their films.
I was in almost continuous production at that time, making films generally on 10-day schedules for AIP. I convinced Sam Markoff, who was head of the money department of AIP, that the thing to do was to do one picture, 15 days, and in color, and put together the two budgets and spend somewhere around $200,000. They asked me what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to do The Fall of the House of Usher.
Once this land was fertile. Farms abounded. Earth yielded her riches at harvest time. There were trees and plant life, flowers, fields of grain. There was great beauty here. But this was long before my time.
I identified with it emotionally because there was a tortured individual, Vincent Price, in the center of it.
I'm going to torture you, Isabella.
He did, have either some great love of his life that left him or betrayed him.
I'm going to make you suffer for your faithlessness to me.
And there was always that fear that, that was going to happen to you, or even early girlfriends that, you had a crush on that liked somebody else, and then you could agonize over that. So there was identifying on that level.
You harlot! You are about to enter hell. Hell! The pit! And the pendulum.
I had a great affinity for Vincent Price and wanted to be the one controlling the pendulum.
Within a few years, the United States was engaged in its biggest military conflict since World War II. As the Vietnam War escalated, the counterculture movement began to grow.
Can you look around this world and believe in the goodness of a God who rules it? Famine, pestilence, war, disease, and death. They rule this world.
There is also love and life and hope.
Very little hope, I assure you.
The Mask of the Red Death was one of the later pictures. We were already into the 1960s. The counterculture was building, and I did indeed incorporate, particularly in some of the fantasy scenes, some of the style that I later developed more fully in my LSD picture, The Trip.
250 micrograms apiece.
Know what I'm going to take?
The youth generation responded by turning on, tuning in, and dropping out. but they still couldn't escape the collective nightmare.
Roger's always been left of center, and his office used to have French Revolutionary posters on the wall, and as he was nickel and diming you for making a picture for him. And a lot of that, I think, shows up in his work. The movies are subversive.
Do you wish to be saved? Saved? No. I've come to tell you what I see.
I knew this would happen.
In 1968, a big-budget studio horror film presented mainstream moviegoers with the death of all certainties.
There seemed to be this confluence of events that made people think, well, maybe this really is the last generation. Maybe Judgment Day is really coming. Maybe we really have gotten too far away from God.
No! Oh, God!
God is dead! Satan lives! The year is won!
Mr. Boogeyman, King of Blood, they used to call me.
In Targets, Boris Karloff realizes that traditional monster movies can't compete with the horrors of real life in 1960s America.
My kind of horror isn't horror anymore. There we are. Look at that.
Richard Nixon reassured voters that the violent few are not the majority of Americans, and urged the great silent majority to stand up and be counted.
I thought it was about revolution. You know, we were 60s guys and thinking, you know, in those terms, sort of pissed off that the 60s revolution didn't work. Peace and love didn't solve anything in the end. In fact, shit was looking worse. And I said, what would be a really earth-shattering thing that would be revolutionary and that people would refuse to ignore? The dead stop staying dead. Oh, and there's one thing more. They like to eat living people.
When Night of the Living Dead came out, it was shocking. It was horrific. And it really shocked me when I first saw it. The fact that there was a black character in it was a big deal. Today it looks like nothing, but if you realize that back then the only black people you saw in the movies was Sidney Poitier in Lilies of the Field or I Spy, you realize that we didn't have black people in movies much. And to have a black guy in a horror movie who ends up, you know, being the only survivor and then senselessly getting killed.
Good shot.
I noted it as being kind of a countercultural movie for that reason.
Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
What bothers me the most about a lot of traditional horror is that why do you do horror? You do it to upset the apple cart. And always at the end it sort of gets set back up again. We kill the monster, you know, we do whatever we need to. And I didn't want to do that. In my mind, most of the power that it has relates to the time that it was made.
All right, send the wagon through.
And the anger of that time.
Hey, Randy, light these torches over here. People in the back, way in the back.
And the disappointment of that time.
As the Vietnam War continued into the 70s, filmmaker Bob Clark offered his own form of protest in Death Dream.
Do you know that they sent us a telegram tonight? I mean, they actually sent us a telegram telling us that you were killed.
They actually said that my son was dead. I was.
That was a scary time. There was a draft, an active draft, and it was scary as shit to be up for that. I remember in college, when the first draft lottery came out, what they would do would draw a number for every one of the 365 days of the year and choose an order. So if you were in the first, if your birthday was, say, January 15th, they would draw a number, and if January 15th came up and it was number 6, you were going to Vietnam. You were going into the service.
At the turn of the decade, the prevailing message of American independent cinema was, we blew it. Audiences had to be psychologically prepared for the worst.
And I remember taking a little journey down Sunset Strip when I first got to Los Angeles, and these guys with long hair were sort of selling acid on the street. And I went to the Whiskey and saw some rock and roll bands. It was a great time for music. Hadn't quite hit the skids as it did in 1969 with Altamont, when that sort of turned dark in Charles Manson. As the culture changed from the 60s into the 70s, everything got harder. There's more sex, then there's more violence. There was a lot of excessive stuff going on.
The Savage cinema is really about random violence, about unpredictability, about seeing the things you couldn't imagine around the next corner. Whether that being that murderers show up at your house one night and go on a killing spree, or that you go on a nice vacation into the desert and it turns out that there are cannibals living in that desert who want the luxuries you have and want to kill the family pet and rape your daughter and do all these, absolutely horrible things.
It's crazy. What's crazy? All that blood and violence. I thought you were supposed to be the love generation.
Last house on the left was it's like a strong cup of coffee in the morning and opened you right up. Wow.
You're gonna get you.
My favorite moment in horror history is in The Last House on the Left. There's a guy named Krug in it, and he had just got done raping a girl. And he stands up, and the girl's not dead. And all these guys, I think there's 3 of them, stand up, and they're kind of talking to each other, and this music's playing. And they look down at their hands, and it's covered in blood and grass. And they're pulling the grass off their hands. And then the lead character looks down at his hands, and there's this look that comes over his face. Over all their faces. It was basically, what the hell did we just do? And they feel disgusted. For a moment, they're disgusted. They're not just madmen and crazy killers. They were humans. And that one moment made me want to do horror films.
Those are films that actually discuss violence in a meaningful way. In our culture, we have made violence acceptable, that when we're attacked, we attack. That violence can be okay under certain conditions.
This is the story of a man who decided to clean up the most violent town in the world.
The Charles Bronson Death Wish films, they say, okay, you've attacked my family, you've murdered my family, you've raped my wife, now I will kill you and it is justified. What Last House on the Left says is that I have acted as violently as you have, my child is still dead, and now what am I left with? What these horror films do is they rip that decorum off killing. They show you the naked ugliness of violence.
To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie.
I don't think they were necessarily social statement movies consciously. I think they couldn't help but express that era and the filmmakers and their countercultural bent regardless, because in those days, making independent films didn't have to go through the meat grinder process that it does now.
In 1974, filmmaker Tobe Hooper suggested there was something cosmically wrong with life in America.
Hint, when malefic planets are in retrograde, and Saturn's malefic, okay, their malefice is increased.
Hey man, you believe all that stuff your old lady's hawking me? I don't know.
Here's an era where people are running out of gas, so they're going to this town. Slaughterhouse has been closed down. People are out of work. It's reflecting a lot of the anxieties of the 70s, only in this family, they're not just unemployed, they're absolutely crazy.
It has this level of insanity that feels very real, and you wonder who made this fucking movie.
Audiences don't want something too horrible.
Hello?
It's not entertaining for them. They want to be entertained. They want to have a good time.
Hello?
They don't mind some of the characters on the screen getting bumped off, even in terrible ways, but you can cross a line, and the audience will turn against you.
Is anybody home?
And if you're a filmmaker, you can sometimes use that to your benefit by teasing the audience. The audience will say, God, are they going to show me something I don't want to see? I'm getting nervous now. This director, I don't trust this director really. He may show me something that's going to really disturb me. If you can ever find that little niche, it's great because the audience then provides most of the action for you in their heads.
After the Vietnam War, the culture war in America raged on, between rich and poor, young and old, us and them.
See the wind blow your dried up seeds away. I'll eat the heart of your stinking memory. I'll eat the brains of your kids. I'm in. You're out.
There are two kinds of horror fans. There are the horror fans who say, you know, I really groove on the monster. I like Dracula. I like the werewolf. I like the Frankenstein monster. And they're picking up on something in those characteristics, the fact that those creatures tend to be sort of despised outsiders.
Why should we treat her so fancy? She's a Frankenstein.
But the Savage Cinema is something entirely different. It's sort of a realization of the fact that life is random and that you don't control your life. You walk into horror with your eyes shut and then have to cope.
What'd you do today?
In The Exorcist, audiences watched helplessly as pure evil attacked an innocent teenage girl.
Oh, Mom, you should have seen this man came on.
Linda Blair's Reagan was everything that was sugar and spice and everything that was the perfect little girl, and she was set up so beautifully in that one little scene with her and her mother talking about her wanting a horse for her birthday.
When could I have one? We'll see, Reagan.
Tiny little details that made you feel you were very intimate in something very human.
All right, give it up. Yeah.
And when that girl then turned on us, she was victimized by this thing, one moment being thrashed around and the next moment she was totally in charge. And any move towards that door that we were going to go through it again.
Well, then let's introduce ourselves. I'm Damien Karras. And I'm the devil. Now kindly undo these straps.
One of the actors in my troupe had seen the movie on the opening night because he had read the book and things, and he was the greatest trailer one could ever get for the movie because this son of a gun could not go home, you know, and was sleeping on somebody's floor by their bed because he was so freaked out. And to go into the theater and feel this sense of fear that we're going to see something evil. I mean, this was going to be really an experience. People came in with that sense already, that anticipation that they were going to be traumatized. And sure as hell they were.
With the Father and the Holy
In The Exorcist, the evil was vanquished.
Amen.
But the national crisis of confidence was far from over. In The Omen, the devil incarnate was adopted by the U.S. president. The future never looked so grim. Horror continued to infiltrate the most commonplace visions of domestic bliss, turning the American dream inside out.
In horror, you can deal with ideas, like with It's Alive. One of the things that made me do the picture was there were so many people alienated from their kids at that time. This is an interesting idea. What happens if you get to be terrified of your own child? The thing that you loved is suddenly the enemy.
In 1975, horror went mainstream. Universal invested millions in Jaws, and audiences flocked to the theaters to see idyllic visions of middle-class American life get shredded.
It does testify to the fact that horror films, which were once the despised others, were becoming the A films of Hollywood. That whereas in years past, a film about a killer shark would have very much been a B film. It would have been a low-budget B film. Instead, it was this big-budget A film with top-of-the-line special effects.
If you forgot what terror is like.
Regardless of their budgets, most horror films portrayed red-blooded Americans fighting for their own individual ideas of the American dream. In The Stepford Wives, the dream was manufactured.
There'll be somebody with my name, and she'll cook and clean like crazy, but she won't be me.
In David Cronenberg's Shivers, sexual liberation was the order of the day, for better or worse.
This was the age of the Equal Rights Amendment, which ultimately did not pass. But also, Carrie was post Roe versus Wade, the idea put into law that a woman has the right to choose what she wants to happen with her body. And so, there was certainly the opportunity there to play on some of those fears, the idea of, well, what if a woman is too powerful?
I got criticized for punishing sexually promiscuous girls, which I never understood. My assignment was to, these vulnerable teenage girls were babysitters and they were being stalked. So the question came up, what do the teenage girls do most of the time? Well, they talk about their boyfriends.
Paul dragged me into the boys' locker room. Exploring uncharted territory.
They're making out with their boyfriends. One of them maybe is a little not quite as far advanced in her social education. So Jamie Lee Curtis is the one who's a little scared of life. And she's actually the one who ends up kicking butt, pretty much. She takes care of business.
Deborah Hill mentioned that she was surprised nobody commented that the one person who hasn't had sex is the one who penetrates the shape, attacks him, is getting out her sexual frustrations because she really has no other outlet.
Alien is totally a film about sexuality, and I think that comes out of the idea that the alien life form is supposed to be a perfect life form. And I guess the idea is if you're a perfect life form, you sort of have to have a perfect and adaptable life cycle. So there's this strong undercurrent about the reproductive cycle in Alien, particularly how the alien co-ops the human reproductive cycle.
By the end of the 1970s, the American way of life had mutated into something unrecognizable. To say nothing of the American way of death. In Dawn of the Dead, George Romero pondered the fate of the nation's silent majority.
What the hell are they?
They're us, that's all.
Zombies, to me, could be any natural disaster. That could be anything. My stories are about the people that deal with it, don't deal with it improperly, deal with it stupidly, deal with it, the stories are about how people screw up.
Dawn of the Dead is celebrated for the whole idea of making fun of the consumer cultures. These guys go to a mall and have unlimited access to all the material goods they ever want, and for a while they celebrate and go crazy, but that's limited.
The Amityville Horror suggested that even the basic dream of home ownership was fraught with demons.
Well, I guess people have had to deal with this ever since Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden.
One writer captured middle-class America's shattered dreams better than any other.
Holy old Jesus!
Stephen King is the horror version of Norman Rockwell. His characters live in your neighborhood. They live next door to you. They experience what you do. And it's not the monster in the closet, but the people who own the house that the closet is in that the story is about.
He obviously saw the same Twilight Zones we all saw, the same Outer Limits, the same Corman movies, all that same stuff, loved that stuff. But because of his writing talent and taking those basic ideas and stories and filling these novels full of the thoughts of these characters.
Has it ever occurred to you that part of being a parent is trying to kill your kids?
I love you, Danny. I love you more than anything anything else in the whole world, I would never do anything to hurt you. Never.
In Stephen King's story, The Dead Zone, the struggle between good and evil came down to the struggle between a man and his country.
I had this deal with Universal to make some movies where I would write the scripts and I'd have complete control and such, which was great. And I wanted to do something about Reaganism, and because it just pissed me off so much.
The politics of the 1980s called for a return to traditional values. But to some, the government policies seemed like a manipulation of American freedoms.
The crowd was kill a commie for Christ, and let's get those commies and kill them. So I grew up laughing at that in Dr. Strangelove. And now here it was again. He had returned, and with this massive enthusiasm behind it, and this unrestrained free enterprise.
It really boils down to our ability to accept. We don't need pessimism. There are no limits.
It figures it would be something like this.
For the home video generation, the decade was defined by slasher movies, beginning with Friday the 13th.
What's interesting about the Friday the 13th series is that if you watch those films, down to a film, Jason is compared with nature.
It's gonna storm.
In every one of the Friday the 13th films, there's a storm coming when he's coming at the same time. So is Jason actually an avenging force of God? You know, is he Mother Nature? Is nature angry? Is God angry at these teens for smoking weed or occasionally doing cocaine or having premarital sex? It was really interesting that the forces of the moral majority and the religious right had such an objection to these films because they were essentially depicting an Old Testament world. You behave badly and you will be killed. Vice precedes slice and dice.
Where are we headed?
About to Camp Crystal Lake.
Oh, yeah. Planning on smoking a little dope, having a little premarital sex, and getting slaughtered?
It's showtime!
Hey, you want a beer? Or do you want to smoke something hot? Or we can have premarital sex. We love premarital sex.
Joke. It's just a joke.
With a new slasher movie being released every weekend, horror movies were big business. The challenge for filmmakers was figuring out how to revitalize the classic monsters for the new generation.
Genre pieces basically deal with, okay, this is a myth, we've established some things. Now, given this as a premise, where do we go with it?
Somewhere in this city, in this human jungle, it begins.
When they released The Howling, none of the ads showed that it was a werewolf movie because that would have seemed old-fashioned and dusty.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolf bane blooms.
It seemed to me that the audience was going to find it old hat and kind of corny. And so we did everything we could do to not make it seem like a werewolf picture.
Hello? Karen? You're kidding me. We'll be right up. Just calm down. Okay, bye-bye.
What is it?
Bill just got bitten by a wolf.
Is bitten by a werewolf and lives,
becomes a werewolf himself.
There's a lot of humor in it, and there's a lot of references to other movies, because it's, I think, the first werewolf movie that presupposed that the audience already knew about werewolf movies. What they don't know is that werewolves are real.
Horror became spectacle again. Back in the 50s, it was spectacle because it was space monsters and all those things. And in the 60s, it drew down into the Norman Bates and Rosemary's Baby, into human drama. It was a new time because suddenly it wasn't just the filmmaker, but it was also the special effects guys, the Rick Bakers of the world, the Rob Bottin's of the world. Spectacle returned in a big way.
Other films took the opposite approach, relying on traditional Gothic atmospherics.
I went to the catacombs in Paris and went down, 6 stories, of stairs, and found myself, wall to wall with skulls and bones from hundreds of cemeteries that had been dug up and all the bones put down there. Talk about Gothic. And that impression was, was the thing that created One Dark Night. It really embraced the old thing of, set up, set up, set up, and what's going to happen. And then when it took off, they were jumping out of their seats, screaming.
John Carpenter's The Fog also drew on the Gothic tradition. He based his old-fashioned ghost story on a legend from America's past.
The 17 or 1800s, they were bringing gold in a ship to Goleta in Santa Barbara. And the town essentially put out a fake fire to draw them to what the ship thought was the beach. They hit the rocks and the ship went down, so they went out and looted the gold. And true story. So I just took that idea of this town with a sort of a dark past.
There's something in the fog.
It speaks to what I think was John Carpenter's growing disenchantment with America in the 1980s. The Fog is about the 100th anniversary of this town, Antonio Bay. And all the people in the town are preparing for a big festival wherein they will remember these 6 great people who sort of formed this town and made it such a wonderful place to live. Well, the only problem is those 6 Americans were thieves.
I'm the 6th conspirator. Take me.
In the suburban neighborhood in Poltergeist, the ghosts were equally restless.
How much room for pool is there?
We own all the land. We've already made arrangements for relocating the cemetery.
You son of a bitch, you moved the cemetery, but you left the bodies, didn't you? You son of a bitch, you left the bodies and you only moved the headstones! You only moved the headstones! Lie! Lie!
What this is saying, essentially, is that your past comes up to bite you on the ass if you do bad things, and that there's no free ride in America, and that if we do bad things, there's going to be blowback.
In 1982, John Carpenter's remake of The Thing offered a bleak look into the future.
He's one of them. When do you think it got to him? I don't know.
Could have been any time, anywhere, if it did get to him.
Hey, look, Childs, come on. When the lights went out, that would have been a perfect time.
It seemed to me that we had hit that wall where we weren't trusting anybody.
Where were you? When the lights went out! That's what it was! The players against each other!
Forget our governments, schools, institutions, bada-boom, bada-boom, bada-boom. We weren't trusting each other. We weren't trusting ourselves.
In George Romero's Day of the Dead, the whole of humanity has been reduced to a group of squabbling survivors.
Fact is, either we are the only ones left, or there's nobody within range of my puny little Second World War signals.
You wear a uniform, whether it's a military uniform or a scientist's gown, it really doesn't matter. I mean, you're just underneath it all. You're just sort of a human, flawed, very flawed human.
Maybe if we tried working together, we could ease some of the tensions. We're all pulling in different directions.
Well, that's the trouble with the world, Sarah darling. People got different ideas concerning what they want out of life.
Return of the Living Dead was just as pessimistic, but far more humorous about the nation's dark side.
Let me ask you a question, kid. Did you see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
Yeah. That's the one where the corpses start eating the people, right?
Did you know that movie was based on a true case?
Come on, you're shitting me, right?
I ain't never been more serious in my life.
Warning. We interrupt this presentation with the following urgent message regarding The Stuff.
The Stuff was a commentary on what people were really doing to themselves with the kind of food they were eating and the cigarettes they were smoking and the vast conspiracy to addict the public.
The Stuff, the taste that makes you hungry for more. Enough is never enough. The Stuff, taste that delivers.
Enough is never enough.
Mother puss bucket.
By mid-decade, monster movies had become so popular that they were being produced and marketed for the widest possible audience.
When I first got involved with it, it was a spec script that Chris Columbus had written, hoping to make a name in Hollywood for himself, and it was being passed around. And when Spielberg saw it, he said, well, this is perfect to make a low-budget horror picture out of it. As it developed, it became obvious that the picture was going to cost a little bit more money than they had thought originally. And therefore, maybe it shouldn't be quite as dark as it was, because the gremlins ate the dog and cut the mother's head off and bounced it downstairs, and it was really gruesome.
What really made the 80s such a great time for at least independent horror movies, genre movies, what I love, was the video. People were clamoring to get stuff for their video machines. There was all this money for independent movies, and we see in the early 80s how many really interesting movies were being made.
I've got something I want to play for you.
Oh my God!
Even the goriest films of the 1980s were defined by their unlikely sense of humor, thanks to a new batch of young filmmakers like Sam Raimi.
Sam Raimi, what he did was he threw everything at you, including the kitchen sink. And, he literally pummeled the viewer. He would use these fast-moving, shaky cam shots where you're barreling at people, the most ingenious shots. A 1 gallon of blood wasn't good enough. He'd have 10 gallons of blood hitting somebody. It was just excess. And again, that speaks to something about the 80s, too, was that was the era of excess.
When we were making Reanimator, I don't think we thought about it as being subversive. I think that we were just having fun. There was no intention of making it funny. But it sort of turned out that way because we kept laughing all the time when we were doing stuff. For us, it was having a delight in doing these horrific things.
Mr. West.
You'll never get credit for my discovery. Who's going to believe a talking head? Get a job in a sideshow.
Wes Craven produced the most iconic character of the decade.
This is God.
A supernatural serial killer named Freddy Krueger.
You have to ask yourself, who was the most towering, charismatic figure of the 1980s? And you could say Ronald Reagan, or you could say Freddy Krueger. They both essentially pursued the same policy, that they were going to, through their actions, visit the sins of the father upon the children.
Daddy, help me!
And what that was in terms of Freddy was that he was going after and killing the children of the people who killed him.
Everything's gonna be all right!
And what Reagan did was put this country so badly into debt, so badly into deficit with the buildup of the arms race, by lowering taxes for the extremely rich. By doing that, what he was doing was he was building up all of this future debt for the children of America.
You are all my children now.
The good thing about Nightmare on Elm Street was it was kind of tongue-in-cheek. I mean, there was scary stuff in it, but then Freddy would always say those one-liners that made you laugh.
This is it, Jennifer. You're big breaking TV. Welcome to prime time, bitch.
and you had this serial killer that was funny and awesome, and I wanted to be him for Halloween every year. And I still have pictures of me as like an 11-year-old, 12-year-old wearing Freddy Krueger. Like I actually had prosthetics on my face.
Over the years, having dealt with this and talked to kids and, you know, particularly the fans of the Fridays or the Freddys and stuff, you know, we all wanted to be unstoppable, you know, in control of the situation, clever with the one-liners, you know, whether it's James Bond or Freddy.
My name is Pussy Galore.
I must be dreaming. You know, if you don't feel you're as handsome as James Bond,
Wanna suck the face.
you know, your identification may be, you know, with one of the monsters.
In 1991, Freddy was succeeded by a more refined Nightmare Man. Silence of the Lambs resonated so strongly with critics and audiences that it captured all 4 of the major Academy Awards in 1991. The question is, why was it so popular?
Serial killers have a human face. You know, they're people we know. They're fellow human beings. They're our neighbors. They're the mailman. They're the guy in a line in the supermarket in front of us or at the gas station. It's a pretty frightening idea when a serial killer could be in such close proximity.
And now I'm going to have to do it again.
My brother introduced me when I was maybe 10 or 11 to a movie called Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. And I think that was my very first experience in the horror genre.
Henry presented the serial killer as the inversion of the American dreamer. A nightmare visionary with his own twisted concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
What are you doing? I want to see it again.
In the old days, I used to think, God, how do these people sleep at night? And as I got older and did a lot of these movies about killers, I realized very well they sleep, very well. A lot of the people I've spoken to on death row, you know, when I've researched characters, they seem to just have absolutely either no emotion.
His pulse never got above 85, even when he ate her tongue.
Or it was something that had to be done, or, yeah, I kind of regret it now, but don't hear any regret.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
That's in and of itself scary.
In Candyman, the serial killer is a mythological figure who inspires as much fascination as fear.
I think there has always been an attraction to the monster or to evil in horror films.
Helen.
For the 2 hours that you sit there in the dark and you watch those monsters,
Who is that?
it's not that you want to be them, it's not that you want to kill anybody, but it's the idea of you are both attracted and repulsed.
Be my victim.
You wouldn't want to run into them. You don't want to leave the theater and skin somebody alive, but you do leave the theater and think, that was cool.
In Seven, the serial killer became a self-righteous judge. He is a monster. But then he says, so are we.
We see a deadly sin on every street corner, in every home, and we tolerate it. Well, not anymore. I'm setting the example. And what I've done is going to be puzzled over and studied and followed forever.
Yeah. Kevin Spacey, I mean, there's the ultimate serial killer right there. John Doe was this little kind of twerpy dude. He wasn't bigger than life. He was normal. He was set in reality. And I think that's more terrifying than a lot of movies, because a lot of movies you take huge leaps. You know, Nightmare on Elm Street, oh, you're sleeping and this guy can kill you in your sleep and you're going to die in real life. Jason Voorhees is some 7'8" dude that, you know, can never be killed. Well, this is just a little twerpy dude who's making these people commit heinous acts.
Oh, fuck me.
And I think that in real life, if you watch the news, some of the biggest acts of violence are normal-looking people. And I think that's really scary.
Any for God's...
Shh, darling. Trust me.
God's sake.
It's for the best.
Hey, please!
With the final sequel to A Nightmare on Elm Street, Wes Craven explored the idea that the monster has somehow outgrown the fictional world
saying Freddy is this ancient thing.
Right. Current version. And for 10 years, he's been held captive pretty much as Freddy in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. But now that the films have ended, the genie's out of the bottle.
We've always had horror stories, whether you go back to Hansel and Gretel or Greek myth or what have you, and that there is a direct line that connects those stories to the horror films Wes Craven is making.
Dylan, this is so violent. I don't know why you like these stupid old fairy tales.
Finish, please.
And those stories have been with mankind all along because they serve some valuable purpose to us. They're the only ones that are making us address our culture and the violence in our culture and the hatred in our culture and the divisions in our culture. The horror movies are the ones that are doing that. So the monsters come from horror movies into our reality because that's where the monsters really live.
You've seen one too many movies.
Now, Sid, don't you blame the movies. Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative.
American Psycho proposed that the most horrifying monster we face is the corrupted American dreamer, dedicated to a warped concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
I think that what makes a good horror movie is you can't just have a villain be villainous. If there's no sense of humanity to him, then he's a caricature. He's not a character.
Tonight, I just had to kill a lot of people.
If you listen to what Hannibal Lecter said, it made sense. And he just happened to eat people as well, but what he said made sense. And I think that the villain in any horror movie has to make some sort of sense.
This horror movie monster is the true American rebel. And for that, we grant him at least partial amnesty.
Given the chance, you would deny me my life, wouldn't you?
Not your life.
My freedom, just that. You take that from me.
Hannibal Lecter kills certain people who deserve to die. So the question is, is Hannibal Lecter a monster or is Hannibal Lecter a hero? I don't think that the villain becoming the hero was actually a very new thing. Because I think that for earlier generations, the Frankenstein monster, in a sense, became a hero. In the 90s, we saw Brad Pitt's Vampire, Interview with a Vampire, being a hero. He offed the bad vampire. What's changed is how our culture has changed. I think it seems like something new in the 90s because we were more uncertain about things in the 90s. We were looking at a more morally relative culture.
In Blade, there is no question that the vampire is the hero. As viewers, we like knowing that the monster is out there. The fear keeps us sharp. On the dawn of the new millennium, horror movies continue to ask viewers to question their reality.
Cole? What?
In the face of death, what do we believe in? In a world where there's a thin line between news and entertainment, fact and fiction,
Hello? It's all around us.
how do we know what's real and what's not?
Roll camera.
In a country raised on Hollywood magic, how do we recognize real evil? One year into the new millennium, America changed forever. But for some, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
I had started to write Land of the Dead. It was going to be my 90s zombie thing. I had finished it and sent it around. I mean, literally like, a week and a half before 9/11 happened. I came back to it again. When that hysteria wound down, and I sort of tailored it for this new normal.
Romero shows us a land where the leaders have taken advantage of a culture of fear to gain money and power at the expense of ordinary human lives. Cannibalism is business as usual.
Nothing changes it, man. What does it take? What does it take to kick people in the ass hard enough to get them to, wake up?
There was an odd line in a movie I made called Starman, where Jeff Bridges' character is dying and he comes to a realization that humans are best when things are at their worst. That's not true. I wish it was true. What happens when people get afraid is real ugly. They get fearful. That's what happened after 9/11, and it took over. So we come back to fear again, which is the universal human emotion. We're all born afraid. People do really crazy and awful things when they're fearful. Awful things. When the tribe gets threatened, you sit around that campfire that we talked about earlier. And now, the easiest story to tell and the easiest story that people will buy in the tribe is the evil's out there. Beyond the dark, beyond the woods, it's the other. That's what we all bought. That's what everybody bought.
In 2003, the year the United States went to war in Iraq, Hollywood producers sensed a new generation of horror fans and rushed to recreate the financial heyday of horror movies.
A lot of businesses are doing it obviously for the business, because it's a movie business, and what's going to make money? Well, if there's a built-in fan base for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, well, they're like, okay, well, if we remake it, we can revitalize a franchise and bring that fan base with it.
In new versions of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Dawn of the Dead, and The Hills Have Eyes, the monsters became faster and messier, and more sadistic than ever before.
When we turn on our TV sets and we see what's going on in Iraq, that's even more horrific than a lot of the movies we're seeing. So because of TV and real life, it's sort of upped the ante on the kind of horrific images that filmmakers can show us. They have to come up with scenes that can shock us. When you go to the movies, it has to be something we haven't seen before. It has to be something even more shocking than what's going on in real life. It's difficult to shock people today.
It's this saturation of horror movie images into politics, into pop culture. I mean, look at Osama bin Laden. I mean, the ultimate boogeyman of America. And then look at how in recent films, like the remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface strikes and then disappears, not to be seen again. It's the Osama bin Laden factor. He was here, he attacked, and now he's gone. When is he going to come back? That's a perfect setup for a horror movie sequel, isn't it? The killer came and attacked us. We never got him. He's still out there.
The independent feature Saw kicked off the most successful horror franchise of the decade.
Dr. Gordon, this is your wake-up call. Your aim in this game is to kill Adam. You have until 6 on the clock to do it.
The Jigsaw Killer acts as a moral judge. But unlike other cinematic serial killers, he gives his victims a choice. Kill or die.
Hello, Amanda. You don't know me, but I know you. I want to play a game.
If you listen to what he says in the Saw movies, there's a moralistic thing to him, which you're like, wow, I kind of see what he's coming from on that. And I think if you would have removed that moralistic thing, Jigsaw would have been nothing. He would have just been a guy named Jigsaw that killed people. But by adding that moralistic thing to him, you understood.
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive. But not you. Not anymore.
Jigsaw was in Saw 1, maybe had 3 minutes of screen time. He had maybe 5 minutes of off-screen, so he wasn't a big character. So we really had to think of Jigsaw as a completely new entity in Saw 2.
We haven't been properly introduced. My name's John.
How do you like to be called Jigsaw?
The jigsaw piece I cut from my subjects was only ever meant to be a symbol that that subject was missing something. A vital piece of the human puzzle, the survival instinct.
It seems that horror comes back with every social discomfort. And even the horror movies and horror novels that aren't as political today as they were in the 60s, 70s, even the 80s, maybe they will look that way in retrospect. Hostel surely represents political and social aspects of today that maybe we won't recognize until later, but it's a xenophobic film. It's about xenophobia. It's about other countries being the other guy, and they're laughable. You know, you don't take them seriously. They can't possibly be as sophisticated as the young American men who find themselves in Eastern Europe.
It's from Ollie. I go home?
What does that express other than let's stay here in America and be Americans? You know, it really does reflect some social and political attitudes of the day.
In the face of a trend toward hyperviolence, some viewers have increasingly turned to foreign films.
Obviously, Guillermo del Toro is one of the most brilliant filmmakers out there now. And what is scarier than The Devil's Backbone, which is a story about wartime and filled with all kinds of symbolism beyond the ghost story. Pan's Labyrinth, another story about war and monsters and other dimensions, and just filled with gruesome political parable.
The horror movies are now kind of searching for where to go. I think when you get to something like Pan's Labyrinth, you see that there's an avenue that hasn't been taken that's pretty interesting.
There's just so many elements of horror for the fans to appreciate. There's the Italian style, the Spanish style, the German style. There's so much to explore, and that's the great thing about being a horror fan is there's just so many different routes you could take to these dark pleasures.
As for those who argue that the American horror movie has run out of ideas, perhaps it has less to do with Hollywood's lack of creativity than with contemporary American culture. The current generation is, in a way, reliving the nightmares of previous generations, on screen and off.
I remember in Vietnam everybody saying, oh, you can't pull out of Vietnam because of the domino theory. All of Southeast Asia will fall to communism if we leave. So we stayed in Vietnam. And what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. So what was it all about? What we should be doing is getting out of there and protecting our borders and protecting ourselves against what is an almost inevitable attack. I'm afraid in my lifetime and my children's lifetime, I'm going to have to see American cities attacked with nuclear weapons.
When we look at crazy things happening in the world, we think in terms of horror movies. What is happening in the world is what's reflected in our nightmares.
You find the world has changed. You look at Sunset Boulevard. Norma Desmond, the character in that, played by Gloria Swanson, is afraid to leave her house because she's going to see how much the world has changed since she was a big movie star. And she lives in her own little world. That's a brilliant performance. Well, you just have to embrace that the world has changed. It is what it is.
In these evolving cinematic creations, we continue to see our past and our future. The circumstances that made us who we are, and the fears that determine where we go from here.